Thank you. I think. Let me just double check on this, because one can never trust a non-living thing. Okay. So that's the reason why these are important structures, right? So if you need microtubules in your cell, then these centrosomes are essentially the nucleation point. This is where it all starts. Think of it as sort of like the Grand Central Station, right? Not like a Union Station, but like Grand Central Station, like all trains lead to Grand Central Station. It's like a major transfer area, right? That's kind of what the centrosome is like. Okay, now let's take a look at movement. We're going to take a look at some of the consequences of this. Now, first of all, what I want to do is I want to talk a little bit about, before we move into microtubules, which is going to be from here on down, what I want to do is I want to talk a little bit about actin movement, and then we're going to move on from actin. It's going to be all microtubules from there on out. So the first thing we want to do is I want to take a look at the mechanism of what's called crawling, right? So crawling is something that is actin driven, and it's an important piece of biology. It's called amoeboid movement. I'm going to insert a slide here. So when you take a look at amoeba, it basically is kind of amorphous looking. But one of the things you need to understand is that when you take a look at actin inside a cell, there's two different sources of actin. First of all, just underneath the plasma membrane is a hard sort of lattice-like structure of what's called cortical actin. And it's a solid. However, in addition to that, around the cell in the cytoplasm is actin fibers that are sort of moving around, flowing around in the cytoplasm. And this is basically called cytoplasmic actin. It's kind of like a gel consistency. It's kind of fluidy. Has fluid dynamics to it. So the way that amoeboid movement works is if the amoeba wants to move, it kind of moves by oozing is what it does. Let's say, for instance, it wanted to take this little fleshy foot and it wanted to move it in that direction. So the way it would work is basically what it would do is it'd break down cortical actin. Oops. It would break down cortical actin and then expose a piece of the membrane. And then what it would do is it would basically push the fluid actin against this membrane. Now that would cause this membrane to bulge out, just like you're squeezing a balloon. And in it, you would have this fluid-filled current pushing this little bulge outward, creating what's called a pseudopod. Then it would attach. And then once it attaches, then it would reconstruct the cortical actin, and that basically keeps it in place. Now, if it wants to move the rest of its body in this direction, all it has to do is break down the cortical actin, and it just pulls the rest of its body along. Okay. So the reason why that's important is because your white blood cells, several of them actually move by amoeboid movement. This is how they actually get into your tissues from your bloodstream, as well as amoeba. But that's crawling, right? So that's one type of movement. That's local. That's very local movement. So, but what if you want to move larger distances? Well, then you got to have a little bit of a different construction. That's where we're going to get to the idea of cilia and flagella. So with cilia and flagella, then basically what you have are long microtubule structures. A flagellum is long, cilia basically are short. And they have what's called a 9+2 arrangement. We're going to take a look at this here in just a second. But basically what they're supposed to do is create kind of like a whip-like action. Both flagella and cilia do that. And we're going to take a look at the basis of that. We're going to also take a look at what this 9+2 arrangement actually is. Before we get there, however, we got to talk about one critical piece of the puzzle, and that's motor proteins. So motor proteins are essentially the proteins that move stuff around, right? So if you think about it, we're going to use an analogy, right? If basically you have a microtubule, your microtubule are basically like the roads that you drive on, right? There's a pathway to go to every destination that you want to get to. Just like in the cell, if there's a destination in the cell that you want to get to, there is a pathway or a microtubule that will lead you there. As a matter of fact, if there isn't one, then you have to lay one. Okay, so these basically are the roads. Wherever you want to go, you have to have a microtubule to do that. And then you have a motor protein, which has two major domains. It has what's called the walking domain. This typically will require energy. So you have ATP that will come in and energize this domain. And that's a necessary component. And then the other piece is called the cargo binding domain. This is the one that hangs onto your cargo. So let's take a look at our analogy. If you used a road to get here, that's like the microtubules in the cell. The microtubules are the roads of the cell. They're connected to every destination in the cell that something would need to go. So then who is the motor protein? Well, the motor protein is your car, which has equal parts, walking domain, motor domain, right? And cargo domain. So what's the motor domain of the car? Well, it's the area that basically is attached to the road. So in this case, it would be the wheels. That's your walking domain, right? Powered by a motor that requires energy, right? A gas motor. That's your energy. That's your ATP. That's what's getting you from point A to point B. And then you also have a cargo domain, right? So that is basically inside of the cabin of the car itself. And then, of course, there's you, right? So then ultimately, a motor domain, a motor protein works exactly the same way as your car. Wherever you want to go, you have to have a car that's connected to the road that can roll you there, and that is under energy, a gas-powered motor that can get you there. Oh yeah, by the way, it'd be nice if you're in it, right? So it has to have cargo in the car in order to get you from point A to point B. So motor proteins are exactly the same. They're exactly the same as you basically driving somewhere. As a matter of fact, when you take a look at motor proteins, the motor proteins are the ones actually doing all the moving. So as a matter of fact, all the vesicles inside the cell are being moved around by motor proteins. So when we took a look at the transport vesicle and we saw, oh, this is going from the rough ER to the Golgi, it wasn't just floating there. There was actually microtubules laid down. What you didn't see underneath of that vesicle was a busy little motor protein that grabbed onto that vesicle and is walking along microtubule tracks that are leading it to the Golgi. Nothing in the cell is random, because random is expensive and inefficient. Just ask anybody who plays the lottery, right? Random and inefficient. That is not your retirement strategy, right? So everything, the cell controls everything. So there is no such thing as just random drift. That's just too inefficient, right? Everything, the cell has laid down everything very intentionally and controls every little piece of what's happening in the cell itself. So then what we have are microtubules that form larger structures called flagella and cilia. And this is basically driven by both microtubules and by motor proteins. In this case, our specific motor protein that we're looking at is dynein. There are different motor proteins, but the one we're looking at here is dynein itself. So let's take a look at the flagellum. First of all, let's take a look at the base of the flagellum. So what's in the actual membrane is what's called a basal body. But let's take a look at the structure of that basal body. here's an image of the basal body. Notice how you have microtubular triplets that are connected together. You have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 of them around a hollow core. Sound familiar? What else had that same structure? Yeah. So here the structure is very similar to the centriole. Why reinvent the wheel? If it works, just deploy it somewhere else. So it's from this base then that you're going to grow your flagellum and you're going to build out your microtubules. And then once you actually do a cross section of a mature flagellum, which is this guy right here, then notice you're going to basically have the same 9. So here's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So that's your 9 doublets. Only in this case, now you have a core of 2. So it's like a hub now in the center. That's where you get this 9+2 structure. This is for both flagella and cilia. But let's take a closer look at this though. This isn't the end of it. Notice these little green blobs right here. There's one here, one here, one here, one here. You can see them differently. So you can see these little green blobs that are connecting to the core. These guys are what's referred to as radial spoke proteins that are connecting the doublets to the hub. Is it starting to look familiar? We're starting to create what looks very similar to a bike wheel. You've got a rim and you've got a hub, and connected to that are spokes, which is important. Why? Because when you take a look at a wheel, a bike wheel, it's important to understand the system of a bike wheel, right? So it's an all interconnected system. The entire rim is connected to itself and to the hub. So here's the thing. If I were to pull down on this side of the rim, what's going to happen to this side? What? It's going to go up, right? So if I pull down on one side of the rim, the other side of the rim is going to go up. Why? Because it's all interconnected, right? Because the rim is interconnected with itself and with the hub in the center, which is one of the reasons why I can rotate the hub and I can get the wheel to turn, the rim to turn. That's an important concept. There's one more protein, however, that I want to highlight. These little green blobs, there's 2 of them. They're like little Mickey Mouse ears on the ends of these microtubule doublets. These guys are dyneins. Those are the motor proteins. So basically what you have is a microtubule doublet with little motor proteins sticking out. Now let's take a look and see what this gives us, the consequence of the structure. So basically what we have is a microtubule doublet that's right next to an adjacent microtubule doublet in the system, but it's all interconnected with each other, right? Because they're all connected to the hub. So they're all kind of interconnected with each other. Now what happens is on each one of these, you've got the dynein cargo domains that are attached to the microtubule. The little feet, the walking domain, are sticking out like this. So that's how your dyneins look. The same thing's also true for this guy. Now, this is basically how you get the flagellum to move. Imagine I've got 2 adjacent doublets. My little walking feet are sticking out on one side. What happens first is one of the microtubules, dyneins, attaches to the other and then starts walking. But the problem is, because it's all connected, it starts to slide this one down. But it's all connected, just like you're pulling down on the bike rim. What that means is as this one goes down, the rest of it goes up and then eventually will bend over like that. Now, when these dyneins let go, it snaps straight. And then the alternate one will bind to its neighbor and start walking. It'll pull it down and that bends everything over. And then it'll let go and it'll snap straight. And they'll alternate back and forth. Walk, bend, release, snap straight. Walk, bend, release, snap straight. And if you keep doing this, alternating back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, what's going to happen is this: bend, straight, bend, straight, bend, straight, bend, straight, bend, straight, bend, straight, bend, straight. And then eventually what you got is basically this flagellum that's whipping back and forth, going from a bent straight to a straight to a bend. So going back and forth until you get a whipping side to side motion. And that'll propel you through the fluid. Notice it's not a rotary system like the rotor, like we saw with the bacteria. So couple of things just to kind of clean up is cell wall stuff, right? So the cell wall has a couple of layers to it. So what we see is cellulose cell wall. There's a couple layers, right? So for instance, if you take a look at cell number 1, the first thing you run into is plasma membrane. And then you got secondary wall, which is the majority of the wall that we see, and of course, primary wall. And this is another next to another cell. So you can see there's another wall system there. So you go primary wall, secondary, and then of course, the membrane. All right, so there's like a couple of layers. And honestly, unless you're in plant physiology, you don't get into the deep woods of the different, the nuances of different structures of primary and secondary layer. But there are multiple layers of plants, of cell wall in plants. Of course, that's an important thing. No, so that's basically the big four, right? So that cytoskeletal discussion was the end of the big four. So we have a couple of extra topics that are important that we're going to clean up, and then we're going to move on to 5. The first big topic is extracellular matrix, right? So the extracellular matrix basically is the environment that the cell secretes around itself. So what happens is a cell will secrete molecules around itself, and then it'll kind of create this background of different molecules, and what's in your extracellular matrix depends on what you are as a cell. And it can be quite unique, very similar to like birds, right? So birds basically build a nest that's very unique to the species. As a matter of fact, you can actually identify birds just by their nest construction, right? So some birds are weavers, some are not. Some are trash collectors. Right? That shiny, gum wrapper is apparently quite impressive to the ladies. Right? So it's like trash. It's like, here, look at this. I got something shiny. Right? So I'm a catch. So that kind of thing. Right? So just, by the way, that'd be like the worst pickup strategy ever. It's like, here, you like my gum wrapper? Right, that would be get you pepper sprayed probably. If you're lucky, maybe tased. But right, so it depends on the cell. Typically, one thing that you do put in there though is a couple of things that are common. You put in what's called ground substance, which is kind of like the background matrix. And there's different things in it. Oftentimes there's glycoproteins in there. There's different types of carbohydrates in there. It's oftentimes can vary from a very fluidy type of a matrix, depending on what you put out there, to a very gel-like matrix. But it's kind of like the backdrop, upon which then you secrete other things like collagen, which is a tough fibrous protein. So this is basically a tough structural protein that many cells will put into their matrix. As a matter of fact, for instance, if you want to know what collagen looks like, nearly pure collagen looks like, grab onto your Achilles tendon. That's nearly pure collagen. So it's very tough, very structural. But for the cell, it can create protection and identity. But it also represents kind of like a structural anchorage point, right? So this is a good strategy for a cell to sort of be able to anchor itself. And that's important because free floating around, right? So if you're just randomly free floating around, that's a tough life to live. You have to anchor yourself and you have to put down roots. And so one of the things that you can do with your cytoskeleton is you can provide anchorage for yourself. So here's a good example. So the cell can make a protein called integrin, An integrin is a protein that's embedded into the membrane. So you can see how it's embedded in the membrane here. On the cytoplasmic side, it's tethered to the actin. This is your cortical actin that I talked about. So it's tethered to that cortical actin cytoskeleton side on the inside of the cell. And then on the outside, it's tethered to its extracellular matrix through a protein called fibronectin. So fibronectin will bind to the integrin, and then another part of it will bind to this tough collagenous fiber that you have in your extracellular matrix. So this is your extracellular matrix. And then that tough collagenous fiber will be sort of your anchorage point, so your reference point. And of course, you can see there's all different types of things out here in your extracellular matrix. You have elastin, which gives you flexibility if you need it. And then you have things like this, proteoglycan, which is part of your ground substance. So basically what the cell is doing is it's steadying itself, right? So for instance, if I'm kind of walking around, I've got an internal skeleton like my actin cytoskeleton, but I also have something that's attached to me like fibronectin that I can use to grab onto something else. For instance, if I'm kind of getting a little dizzy and I'm about ready to go down, one of the things I can do is I can grab on to something that's attached to the wall and I can steady myself. So what do? I did exactly what the cell's doing, right? Basically, I've got an internal skeleton, like my actin cytoskeleton, like this one. And then I've got some sort of an attachment component, my arm, right, which is really like the integrin fibronectin complex. And I'm using that to grab onto an external environment that I built. I mean, I didn't build the room, but imagine I built this, right? So this is something that I actually secreted as an individual. I built this. So I can actually grab onto this and anchor myself and steady myself, right? That's exactly what the cell is doing. And then once I do that, then I can basically be a little more functional, okay? As opposed to hitting the floor. So the last topic that we have is cell connections, right? So basically now that we have cells and we have organelles in the cells and we have a lot of stuff that these organelles can do, then the question is, how do we start to connect these cells together? And how do we identify these cells, right? For instance, how does a liver cell know to zipper up to another liver cell? Well, obviously they need some sort of identification. They need to be able to read each other, right? They need to have some idea of cell identity. And there's two major structures that will help you do that in the cell. First of all, glycolipids have a cell ID function, and also glycoproteins. We'll also do cell ID and sorting. So the reason why two liver cells know each other as two liver cells is because they've got a very specific glycoprotein and a glycolipid profile on their membrane that basically makes them look like a liver cell. Okay, so it's not unlike us, right? How do we cluster together into groups? Well, because we see something very similar about each other and we tend to sort of cluster together, right? You see this, by the way, a lot in immigration, right? When you kind of first come over, like in New York, for instance, famous for this, you get pockets of different immigration communities. Why? Because they all look similar to each other. It's what they're familiar with, right? So you got like the Italian sector and the Irish sectors, and then you've got these pockets of regional ethnicity that originally started with the original immigrants. Why? Because externally they look very similar to each other, and so they naturally group up. The same thing's true for cells. Their glycoproteins and glycolipids make them look very similar to each other, so they naturally start to group up. And then when they group up, they have to fasten together. We'll talk about that next. So one of the there's lots of glycoproteins out there, by the way. You have lots and lots of glycoproteins on your cells, okay? One of the big ones is a glycoprotein set called the major histocompatibility complex, which is essentially your self tags. And every single cell has this on it. Right, so every single one of your cells has a U tag. So it's like every single one of my cells has a mark tag on it. So my immune system grows up with my body reading my name tag, right? It's like, okay, these cells say mark on it, therefore you belong. So I'm not going to kill you today, right? But if I were to get a liver transplant from Bob, then all of a sudden my immune system is like, you know what? These cells have Bob's name on it. These don't belong in here, so I'm going to kill you. I don't care if this liver is saving your life. I'm going to kill you anyway because you don't belong here. So your immune system only recognizes self versus non-self. And in situations of autoimmune disorders, this is a situation where your immune system is a little over aggressive, right? So it's not responding correctly to the self tag. That is to say that it's attacking cells that have my name tag on it. So they shouldn't be attacking my cells, but they are. So they're a little on the over aggressive side. Okay. So these are basically the connections. So once you sort your cells out and you identify yourselves, now you have to fasten yourselves together to make tissues. And these are basically the major groupings. There's really only three. First of all, there's tight junctions. And then there's communications junctions. And then there's a whole swath of adhesive junctions in between. Now, there's always a trade-off typically. And the trade-off is obviously communication. You can either double down on that versus connection. You can't have both. Right? If you want a tight connection, then you have to give up on communication. If you want maximum communication, you got to give up on tight connection. And so you have one or the other. And you have two polar extremes, tight versus communication, and you have everything in between. So let's take a look at the everything in between first. So the adhesive junctions come in a lot of varieties, right? So for instance, you have adhesive junctions that are adherins. You also have what's called desmosomes and hemidesmosomes, and there's actually others. One particular type of adherin junction is what's called a cadherin, calcium-dependent adherin is what it means. And this is a pretty typical example of the way these work. So here you notice you get basically a protein that's tethered to your cortical actin, so that's your cytoskeleton on one side. And then there is an extracellular space or an extracellular receptor that reaches outside the cell. And then on the other cell, this is cell number 2 over here, there's the same situation where they have this sort of receptor extending out into space. So it works very much like a train hitch. So I've got one train hitch, you've got another train hitch, and our two train hitches meet each other and they basically grab onto each other. And that's a nice connection. Now, the thing you should notice is between these cells, there's some space, which means that you can basically secrete molecules out here and you can talk to each other. So there is a little bit of space in there, right? That's the communication component. So you have a little bit of connection, but you also have a little bit of space in there so you can do a little bit of connection. So it balances versus connection to varying degrees. So this is basically like what I like to think of as a piece of fabric that's been buttoned together, right? So you have two pieces of fabric that have buttons to it, but in between the buttons is free space. So you can actually reach in between those buttons and actually do like, I don't know, grab something from an inner pocket or something like that if you wanted to, right? But that's because you got a little bit of free space there. Now let's take a look at the two extremes. Let's start off with the tight junctions. First of all, the tight junctions are two proteins that basically are connected to each other and they're very tight. So there's no space, there's no leakage. No space between these cells. So these are nice if you want to have an impermeable barrier. So here you have maximum connection, minimum communication. And then you have communications junctions. There's two different types. They're basically the same structure. There's gap junctions and there's plasmodesmata. So basically what this happens is you have cells which are connected to each other through these channels, these gaps. So what happens inside cell number 1, the cytoplasm, will immediately move into cell number 2. So it's kind of like both cells are getting the instructions at the same time. So here you have max communication and you have minimum connection. This typically is used for coordination of response. A good example of this is your heartbeat. Unlike your other skeletal muscles, your heart muscles have to all contract at the same time. The only way that you can get heart muscles cells all to contract at the same time is if they all hear the message at the same time to contract. The way you do that is by interlinking your heart cells with gap junctions. Right, so this is maximum communication, minimum connection. And then of course, these are the two extremes. So all of your adhesive junctions have varying ratios of each of these. That's the reason why there's so many adhesive junctions. And so this is kind of what it looks like. So here's your tight up here. You can see they're basically very battened together. And then here's your adhesions. You can see this is a type of what's called a desmosome. So you can see like this little protein pad here on each side, little cytoplasmic fibers. And then they have these connecting components to sort of connect them across. But you can see there's still some free space there where you can get some communication a little bit. And then, of course, your gap junctions, which basically looks like a sieve. And this is important, right? Because the one thing I want you to see is the reality of it. So here's the cartoon of it over here, but this is what it really looks like. So when we say there's a bunch of gaps in there, we're not just talking about one or two. We're talking about like an entire sieve. So when these two cells are connected with gap junctions, it's porous. So they really, really are in communication with each other. So one doesn't happen unless it happens to the other. Okay. And then, of course, in plants, you have plasmidesmata, which are essentially gap junctions across the cell wall. And so here you can see the plasmidesmata, and you actually have a piece of your smoothie art that kind of oozes through this from one cell to another. And this basically interconnects all cells. So why would you do that? Well, think about it. If you've got cell walls, it's going to make getting water into you very difficult, isn't it? How does the water get into you? How do you move things throughout a plant if you've got all these cell walls, right? Every time you enter into a cell, it's like a barrier. You got to figure out how to get out of this chamber because you've been walled in. Well, it's not such a barrier. Why? Because all of these cells are interlinked with these plasmidesmata. So basically what this does, it increases the transfer of water and nutrients and solutes and things like that throughout the plant so that it can move more efficiently. Okay. And you get more into that actually if you get into plant physiology. Okay. So that's the end of 4. Any questions on 4? Feeling good? Yeah, 48 hours to feel better. Yeah, you're like, I'm gonna need all 48 hours. Yeah. Okay, 5. No rest for the weary. Okay, so chapter 5, now we're talking about membranes. So we're gonna get so we talked a little bit about organelles. We kind of did a little bit of a spread of the cell and all of its major functions and things like that. Now we want to dig focus in a little bit on what's going on in the membrane itself to see kind of what some of the things are happening there. So first of all, we already know a little bit about the membrane, right? We already know that the phospholipids are in a lipid bilayer, right? So we already know that part. We covered that one in chapter 3. So we want to bring that one back with us. Right, so we already know that one. We also know that there's proteins embedded in these things, don't we? We actually just looked at one just not too long ago, integrin, right? We said integrin is a type of protein that's embedded in the membrane. And so we know that as well. But here's like a common question, right? So we talked a little bit about these membrane embedded proteins, but we haven't really gotten to them because this is where we're going to get to them in chapter 5. So the real question is, okay, that's fine. There's those membranes and there's proteins embedded in the membrane. So the question is, how many proteins are we talking about? And what does a membrane actually look like? So if there's all these proteins out there, then what does the membrane really look like? And that's kind of where we get to this idea of the membrane structure. And so originally we had this idea of membrane structure called the fluid mosaic model. And literally what we had was this kind of image, and I've actually heard biologists mention this idea of rafts on an ocean. That the fluid mosaic model was a model that described the structure of the membrane, where you had these sort of raft-like floating proteins that were sort of floating around the lipid bilayer, just like a raft on an ocean. But see, here's something that I want to, and this is the way we thought about it. This is the reason why we use the rafts on an ocean idea. Think about it for a second. Just think about that phrase, rafts on an ocean, and let an image sink into your brain. What image are you seeing in your brain? What does a raft look like to you? Huh? A raft? An oval? It's light, it moves, right? How big is it? How many people can I put on a raft? 10? Depends, right? I mean, usually if you think of a raft, there's a couple of ways you can think about it, right? I mean, you can think of the whitewater rafting. That's what Megan's going for, right? So that one, if you are bussing people up so they can raft down or something like that, then you're probably thinking 10. But here's what this is. That's an image that is a consequence of your generation. Think about it. Back in the day, what did rafts traditionally used to look like? And when would you use one? Remember, you're on an ocean. You're not whitewater rafting. So what does your raft look like? Yeah, right? Think Castaway. Yeah, right? So it's like, it's not pretty, is it? A couple of pieces of wood, you lash it together. In some cases, might be just enough for you. I mean, 10 people would be like a hotel, right? I mean, that's what a raft was back in the day, right? Notice the reason why I pull that out is because notice where we are. We're in the ocean. So what does a raft that you find in the ocean look like? It's pretty crude, isn't it? It's whatever you can tie together and keep together, and how big is it usually? Yeah, right. Yeah, it's tiny. Yeah, it's tiny. I mean, depending on how many people there, it might be big enough for maybe 2 people, right? I mean, but it's pretty small. Okay, so here you are on this little raft that you've lashed together, pieces of driftwood, and you're on an ocean. what do you mostly see? Why don't we find people on rafts in the ocean? Yeah, what are we seeing mostly? As a search plane is flying over, what do we mostly see? Water, right? I mean, just an endless horizon of water. And then we're looking for this little raft in there, which is a reason why you don't get saved, because it's almost nearly impossible to find that little raft amidst the ocean. The image is actually the way we thought about things. We used to think that proteins in the membrane were mostly rare, like rafts are rare on the ocean. And that, for the most part, when you did have proteins floating around like rafts, is that they did just what a raft did, right? I mean, you're going wherever the current's taking you, right? I mean, you're on a raft, so you're just going somewhere else, maybe another deserted island, a different one, maybe one worse. I don't know, right? But it's all random, isn't it? You're just drifting about, and basically there's vast, endless expanse of water between you and the next sign of civilization. And that's the way we used to think about it. We used to think of occasional proteins separated by vast expanses of membrane, hence the term rafts on an ocean. And that's actually, so this is actually what the book writes. This is a little too minor league, actually, because the actual cell biosis of the Anschutz mentioned this is like rafts on an ocean. Or is it? Well, let's do a little bit of construction first, and we will take a look at the fluid mosaic model. So this is all review. I'm not going to spend any time here because we've already seen this in chapter 3. This should already be there. Okay, so that's our phospholipid construction. So when we put our phospholipid together into our bilayer and we embed proteins, you can see we have all sorts of different proteins, right? So we have proteins in this case that look like they're channels. Here's our integrin. Here's our integrin over here. You can see that little fibronectin that's connected to that extracellular matrix fiber. You can see glycoproteins are popping out there with their little carbohydrate branches. They're connecting to the extracellular matrix. You got a protein here that's connected to your actin cytoskeleton. You got another one here. So these are all different types of jobs. So you not just have your membrane, but you got a lot of these proteins embedded in there. And also notice this little guy right here. That's a molecule of cholesterol. So cholesterol actually turns out to be a pretty important component of your cell membranes, actually. Not just the precursor for important steroids like estrogen and testosterone, but also an important structural component for your membranes as well. And then, of course, we have a glycolipid over here, right? So you have all these little identification markers all sticking out of the cell itself. Oh, but it's actually worse than this. We'll talk about that here in just a second. So a couple of things, first of all, to lay down, because this is just our foundation. So we just got to lay down our foundation so we can start to put some things together, right? We already know that our phospholipid bilayer basically forms our barrier, right? So we get that one for free. But it's a really good barrier to permeability. And this is a really important thing, right? Because think about it. You have basically the no water club. Nobody is getting through this barrier. So if you're water, nope, not going to happen. Why? Because you got this big non-polar region here. If you're charged, not going to happen. If you're polar, not going to happen. However, guess what? If you're non-polar, sure, come on in. Why? Because you're like the non-polar tails. So there's nothing there to bounce you out, right? What's a good example of a non-polar that could get through? Well, how about estrogen? Right, that's a steroid, it's a lipid. so it can sneak through. Testosterone, same thing, right? It can sneak through the membrane. So the receptors that actually bind to the testosterone are inside the cell, not outside the cell, because estrogen and testosterone and other lipids can get through. By the way, those lipid-soluble vitamins, they can sneak through the membrane because they are lipids. Okay. So here's the problem, though. Think about this for a second. You've got this circle, right? That's what your lipid bilayer is at this point. You've got this circle of lipid bilayer because we got that one for free. We learned about that one in chapter 3, didn't we? So you got this one for free. So here's the question. You got to get stuff in and out of you. Most of your chemistry is aqueous. That means it's water-based. That's your main solvent, right? But guess who cannot get into you? Water. A lot of the things you need, salts and stuff like that, are polar. But guess what can't get into you? Right? You need a lot of charged things. Sodium, for instance, calcium, but those cannot get in. So if we just leave it like this, we just have this lipid bilayer, what have we built for ourselves? Yeah, it's like if we were to build a house of all wall, solid wall, ceiling, floor, all wall. If we do that, what have we made for ourselves? Oh, it's worse than useless. Because notice I said the entire thing is wall. The entire thing is wall. What have you done to yourself? What? Yeah. Think Cascabel Amontillado for you Poe fans. And if you haven't read that, go read it. It's a great one. Right? So that's what happens, right? Because you have to get out, don't you? You have stuff that you need to get in. You need to get food in, you get trash and things like that out. So if you walled yourself in, you've essentially created a tomb for yourself. So that immediately sets up this need for the cell to create transport so you can get stuff in and out of the cell. So how do you do this? Easy. You just stick proteins in your membrane. Well, how do you actually build a more functional house so you can get stuff in and out of you? Easy. Just build holes in your wall, right? Some of those holes we're going to call doorways so we can actually go in and out. Other holes we're going to call windows. We don't plan on getting in and out of those, right? But that's for other purposes, to let in sunlight, maybe open it up to let fresh air in. Different function, same idea, a hole, but it has basically a slightly different function. So we have these proteins then that we're going to insert into the membrane, and basically what they're called is transmembrane proteins. Now there's a little bit of nomenclature and a little bit of terminology here that I want to clear up because it oftentimes will confuse students. Because we've already seen one, right? And it's the idea of a transmembrane protein versus an integral protein. So basically an integral protein is one that is embedded into the membrane. It's integrated into the membrane. Now, integrin is a type of integral protein. It's just one type, okay? So you have multiple different types of integral proteins. So here's the one thing I always like to tell students to kind of keep, because often what will happen is students will get these mixed up, right? Integral and integrin and all that sort of stuff, because they're very similar to very close together. But here's the thing. Not every integral protein is integrin, but integrin is an integral protein. Let me say that again. Right? Not every integral protein is integrin, but integrin is an integral protein, right? Now, because of that, that's confusing, right? The way you integrate a protein into the membrane is by using what's called a transmembrane domain. So I tend to use the term transmembrane. So I don't use the term integral proteins. I use the term transmembrane proteins, which are essentially integral proteins. So I use this as a synonym to differentiate what we're talking about. Right? Because we see all the integral proteins, that is all the proteins that are embedded in the membrane. When we study them up close, we notice that they have all what's called a transmembrane domain. And so instead of calling them integral proteins, because they get confused with integrin and things like that, then I refer to integral proteins as transmembrane proteins, because we know the domain that does it. We also have different types of membrane-associated proteins. So these are what's called peripheral proteins. So they're just kind of out there hanging out. They're groupies, if you will, at the membrane. And they're assisting other things out there. And then, of course, you have the different types of cell surface markers out there. Glycoproteins are out here, right? We saw those. And, of course, glycolipids are going to be hanging out there as well. Those are all important components of your structure. Okay. And this is just a table for you table folks of different types of transmembrane proteins and cell surface markers and things like that. This kind of puts everything together for you guys in one table. That's for you table folks who like to study off of tables. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at this whole fluid mosaic idea and sort of crack this open. No pun intended here, but anyway, because that's what we're going to do. Actually, we're going to crack it open. So basically, the fluid mosaic model. This is going to be a test for mosaicism. The experiment for mosaicism. And it's called the freeze fracture. And here's how it works. Basically, what you do is you take a cell and you put it inside some freezing compound. And it's pretty crude. It's very mechanical. You just basically stick a knife in there and you just give it a twist and you crack it. And it's going to fracture in lots of different random patterns, but every now and then you'll get lucky. You'll get a lot of sections that just aren't worth anything. But every now and then you'll get lucky, and then it'll basically rip apart the cell membrane. So like part of the cell membrane, like the outer part, is going to be stuck to one part of the freezing compound, and that leaves exposed the bottom part of the freezing of the other cell. And then what you can do is you can prep these two pieces, these two layers, for electron microscopy. And the idea is simply this. Well, if we have these rafts on the ocean, the question is, how many do we have out there, right? And what's out there? Like, for instance, do we have mostly proteins that go all the way through, or do some of them go through one layer of the cell membrane and not the other, right? And so you could see that, right? So you can see like different types of cells that will penetrate all the way through, and some that will only be like on one side or another. And so when we did this, basically we took a look at the surface, and actually what we did is we ignored this one here because we figured that they were already gone. And what we did is we looked at this top layer here. So we were looking at the bottom layer on one side and then what was poking already out on the top from the other side. And that's what we have here. Okay. So take a look at this. And the resolution isn't all that good. So notice what we have. So here's your external surface here, and the lower half is shown below. Every single one of those dimples is a protein. But look carefully. There's a lot of dimples. So for instance, there's one, there's one, there's one, there's one, there's one. I'm going to, some of the bigger ones I'm going to highlight just to give you an idea. Some of them are very big, you can see, some of them are smaller. But notice the unevenness. The unevenness is caused by the tops of proteins. That's these little proteins creating a lot of unevenness in the membrane. This is just the top. That's just what I could see straight off. So I missed a bunch here. So there's one, there's a bunch right there. There's a whole bunch of them right here that I missed. Some of them are big complexes. So you can see all of a sudden now, you're not just talking about the occasional protein. You're talking about a ton of proteins. So it doesn't really look like RAFs is accurate anymore, does it? Really, what this looks more like now is a busy marina. You ever seen a busy marina? Not like anything we have here in Colorado. Like Miami, that's a good example, right? Because everybody wants to go to Miami if you're a boater. Not if you're not a boater. Right? Have you ever seen the busy marina in Miami? How much water do you see? Yeah, not much, do you? I mean, between the gangway and the boats, right? I mean, you can pretty much walk from one boat to the next and almost see almost no water at all, right? Except for like the open thoroughfare so the boats can traffic in and out of the marina. But that seems to be more like what's going on here, a busy marina, not rafts on an ocean. So what did this do? This basically blew our mind. That means there's a lot more function out there than we thought. There's a lot more stuff going on out there than we thought. So all of a sudden, this kind of reframed how we thought of the membrane. And this was a really important, an important experiment. So now let's go ahead and take a look at the other part of it. That is the membrane, right? We talked about the mosaicism part of it. Now let's talk a little bit about the fluidity piece. So we need to refresh our memories on the structure of the phospholipid. So remember, we've got a glycerol backbone with two fatty acids on it on one side and a polar phosphate head on the other. We already know that it spontaneously forms a lipid bilayer. And so this is basically what we get for free. But this is what causes the barrier, right? So this is always a bit of a problem. But we also know a little bit about the fluidity, right? So the fluidity is created by the phospholipids. So what our hypothesis was, was that these weren't just static, but these were floating around side to side, right? So like, for instance, if you were to have this phospholipid right here, it wouldn't just stay there. It would actually move around. It would kind of laterally sort of float around and sort of drift around, similar to the way water molecules sort of mix around when you're in the ocean, right? So the reason why things kind of are drifting around, they kind of move around in the water, is because the water molecules are sliding by each other and they're kind of like sort of mixing around, just like you would do in just like a mixer when you're just kind of working the crowd, right? You're just sort of mixing around and eventually you find yourself on the other side of the room and then you kind of work your way back to the other side and you're just sort of mixing around. There's a sense of fluidity associated with you. And the idea was the same thing is true with the phospholipids, is that they're basically moving around and sliding past each other, just sort of like random drift, very similar to the way water molecules do in water. But the question is, how do you know? Well, we did an experiment. In this case, this was an experiment for fluidity. What we did was called a cell fusion experiment. So we took a mouse cell and we had some membrane proteins that we were able to tag, and some humans that were able to tag. We were able to visualize them. And the idea was simply this: we're going to fuse these two cells together, right? So if we have a fluid situation, then when these two cells fuse together, then they should intermix. So you should start to see these starting to move around. If it's non-fluid, then you should see a cell that does not intermix, not intermixed. So what we did was we took this human cell and this mouse cell, labeled, fused them together, and then what did we see? Intermixing. So the question is, how did these blue human proteins get over to the other side? So how did this guy get all the way over here? The only way he could have done so is if he were floating around in the lipid bilayer. Just like if you were drifting, the way that you end up in one part of the ocean versus the other is because the water molecules are moving around and they're moving you around. So you are drifting basically around in the ocean, which is how the whole rafting thing works, right? And so you can see then that you have to have fluidity in order for these to end up on both sides of the cell to get intermixing. So this intermixing of proteins when you had cell fusion was basically what solidified the fluidity of the membrane. So yes, we did have fluidity like an ocean, but instead of like rafts, what we had was a ton of proteins out there. So it's a little bit different than we originally thought, right? So that's great. Your membranes are fluid. Well, what affects the fluidity? Well, we already know a couple, don't we? Because I already talked about the margarine effect, right? So the presence of double bonds affects your fluidity. So we already mentioned how you can mix and match saturated versus unsaturated in order to get varying melting points, right? So you can get a thicker or a more stout membrane, or you can get a runnier membrane, a thinner membrane. But the other thing is also, when it comes to membranes, is temperature, because we talked about melting point, right? What does temperature do to a membrane? Well, it does what it does to every fat, right? What does it do to a fat? If you heat up shortening, what does it do? It melts, right? So that basically means you get runnier and you lose your structural integrity. So temperature has the same effect. It affects the fluidity. So the higher the temperature, the greater the fluidity. Yes? Well, that's a bad idea. Because think about it. You're a cell. You're out there in the world. You're trying to make a go of it. You happen to be near a hot thermal vent. And so basically, as you get closer and closer to that deep sea thermal vent, you're starting to experience higher temperatures, and then eventually your membranes melt. Essentially becomes too fluid to hold anything together. That's obviously bad, right? But guess what? The opposite is also a problem, isn't it? If you decrease the temperature, what's going to happen? Yeah, you're going to decrease your fluidity, right? So if you go into a frozen area, then instead of your membranes melting, your membranes are going to turn solid as a brick. Also a bad idea. So here you have these polar extremes of massive fluidity fluctuations based on temperature. So how do you basically sort of smooth out these extremes? It's simple. You toss cholesterol in there. So cholesterol, basically, what it'll do is it stabilizes the membrane. during temperature fluctuation. So cholesterol, not being a fatty acid, doesn't behave the same way as the other lipids do. It is a lipid, but it doesn't behave the same way because it's got a different structure. So what happens is cholesterol isn't going to change its fluidity because it gets hot. It just doesn't. It's just not shaped. It's not structured that way. So when you stick cholesterol in your membrane, what happens is you're basically making sure that your membrane doesn't get too runny when the temperatures increase. But at the same time, your membrane doesn't get too solid when your temperatures decrease, right? So what does, it basically stabilizes against those extreme temperature swings. And that's the reason why you need to have cholesterol. You have to eat cholesterol because otherwise it would wreak havoc on your membranes. Okay. So let's take a look at what's going on in these membranes, right? So if we've got so many proteins out there, what are they all doing out there? Well, as it turns out, there's several different functions that your membrane is doing. So you'll have transporters, and that's what we spend most of the chapter talking about. You also have enzymatic proteins out there. You have cell surface receptors out there, taking in incoming signals. You have identity markers out there like glycoproteins we talked a little bit about. You have adhesion proteins, we already talked about those guys, right? So those are all different types of proteins. Cytoskeletal anchors, right? We talked about that. Integrin is an example of those. So these are all basically the functions that the cell membrane goes through. And this is just basically the visual, right? So you visuals, this is basically what we're talking about. So here's your cell transporters. They're basically allowing things to pass through the cell, usually a polar molecule, right? Or certainly hydrophilic. An enzymatic reaction, right? Where you have a reactant turning into a product. You have a cell surface receptor, which is taking some sort of a signaling molecule that was secreted by another cell, typically. And it's radiating some sort of a message to the cell to give it instructions. Your ID marker, this is your glycoprotein. So that's going to be your cell sorter. Your cell, that's a tight junction type of this situation. So you have the cell junction, cell adhesion. And then of course your cytoskeletal anchor, this is your integrin, anchoring your cell to the extracellular matrix. So one of the things that I want to do, and I always do at this particular point, just to kind of paint a little bit of a spectrum of sort of where we were in understanding this and sort of as this was all coming together, is to kind of give you a sense of an analogy of what the membrane is actually like after all of this stuff, right? So we did the freeze fracture experiment. That kind of blew our mind because now all of a sudden we've got all these proteins out there. And of course, the first question is, what are you all doing out there, right? So, I mean, we didn't think you were doing that much. What are you all doing? And as it turns out, as we got through there, over the course of time, and very slowly, we came up with this list of functions that were going on out there. But we're not just talking about the occasional transporter out there. We're talking about a lot of functionality going on out there. And what this did was it kind of radicalized, really, the way we saw how the cell actually worked, right? And it parallels, actually, a similar discovery going on in a completely unrelated discipline that happened to have almost like a parallel historical trajectory that I kind of want to sort of sketch out for you, just to kind of show you how we came to think about cell membranes and how we sort of changed our thinking to what the current status is. And so I want to go to archaeology. Right? It's probably the only biology class where we talk more about other disciplines than we do about biology almost. But here, and this is the reason why, right? Because we used to think, because we've talked about it already, and it makes total sense, right? We talked about the cell membrane as a barrier, right? And we talked about it, being able to let some things in and some things out. And when you couch into that also, we've been talking a little bit about secretory pathway, right? Where we got all these functions going on that are inside the cell, right? There's a lot of business going on inside the cell. And so a lot of our chemical reactions are happening inside the cell. And so we had this sort of image in our head of the cell being sort of, by analogy, almost like one of those ancient city states that we learn about in history, right? Where you basically have a city and you have a lot of activities and commerce and economy going on inside the city. And then you kind of had it walled off, right? But that wall was largely a protective barrier from the outside world, because back in that day, you didn't have standing armies. You just basically, if you were out there on your own, you pretty well got mugged and whatever, right? I mean, that's kind of what happened. You just marauding raiders all over the place, just taking what they want. So it was not an easy place to live in back in the day. But when we looked at archaeology, and this is kind of what changed our view of things very quickly, because it was changing at the same time in archaeology. Because originally what we used to think is these old city walls were just defensive barriers. Just basically build a wall and you'll keep the bad guys out, right? That was the idea. It doesn't work, by the way. Just ask the Chinese how well the Great Wall worked, right? It didn't, if you're wondering. The Mongols figured out a way to get through anyway. So it was supposed to be a defensive barrier, right? But here's the thing. If you wall yourself in, is that a good thing? No, right? Because you still need to be able to get some stuff in. There's outlying communities that need to do commerce with you, and you want to do commerce with them, right? Because that makes your economy vibrant, makes you a really big city, and it's a good thing. So what we used to think is that in your walls, you would build these city gates, right? And of course, we used to think of these gates as sort of like a European gate, right? Complete with forbidding wooden door and the moat, right? With any number of piranha in there and things of that nature. And of course, the idea of a gate originally was like, okay, this is going to be a way for you to get into the city, but we're largely going to be protecting ourselves, right? So we're largely walling you out, but there's certain individuals that we're going to allow to come in. Very similar to sort of like the nuclear power complex, right? It's restricted entry. So you get to set a garrison of troops there at the gate. They get to monitor who's coming in and going out. If you're up to good concerns, if you're peaceful endeavors, then you can come in. You can enter into the city. You can enjoy the economy of the city. You can do your commerce. You can sell your wares, whatever it is, and then you can leave, right? And that's the way you think about it, right? Outlying communities, which were building things, making things, growing things. And then they would come in and they would have like security clearance to come into the city. And then they would sell their stuff and they'd set up shop and markets and things like that in the city to sell their stuff. And then they would leave. Otherwise, that was all happening in the city. And so largely the wall was seen as defensive. And what we started to see is if you take a look at the evolution of the wall in archaeology, it's actually quite interesting, right? Because the walls start getting thicker. And you're thinking, okay, that's great, right? If a thin wall protects you, then a thick wall should do better, right? And then as you get thicker, you start to get these, giant gates, with double doors on them and things like that. And some of the walls started actually getting to become double walls. So you'd have an outer wall, you have like an inner wall courtyard and an inner wall, right? Kind of like the Berlin Wall was that way. Right. Only you didn't want to get caught in here. If you're trying to cross the wall, you're sitting duck in there, right? Which is one of the problems with the wall. But of course, then you have to build a gate system that traverses the thickness of the wall. Well, what we discovered in archaeology was a wall, a gate that was actually fairly extensive. So not only did the walls actually start to increase in the sophistication, but what we noticed was the gates weren't just doors anymore. And they weren't just archways or whatever, but they were starting, like they unearthed a gate complex. So this is a big complex, a gate that had these like little rooms in them and like multiple stories. And of course, most of the time, most archaeologists hypothesize and speculate that those were probably like barracks. You kind of have a station of troops there. Makes a lot of sense. And that way you have kind of a ready military force at the wall, ready to defend it, and that sort of thing. But there was one particular phrase in antiquity that always kind of eluded people. But a lot of times people really never understood what this meant. And you see it in ancient literature. You see it a couple of times in biblical literature, actually. This idea of somebody, usually talking about some Jewish patriarch, usually, somebody sat in the gates of pick your city. And there's that phrase, you see that from time to time, right? There's a matter of fact, there's one particular one where it says Lot, right? The nephew of Abraham, the patriarch, Jewish patriarch, Lot sat in the gates of Sodom, right? And a lot of times people would look at that and be like, what does that mean exactly? I mean, what does it mean to sit in the gates? And you hear that from time to time. And nobody really knew what that meant. And it's not like Lot was like a Walmart greeter. It's like, hi, welcome to Sodom, right? Just watch out for the fire and the brimstone. Just, of course, that wasn't happening. But anyway, right. So it wasn't like he was a Walmart greeter. What they figured out was that in these rooms, this is basically where people in the outlying communities would come when they had issues to settle. These were courthouses. So people from the surrounding community would come in and they would have some sort of litigation against each other, and they would be heard by a judge who would then determine what the course of action should be according to whatever the laws of Sodom were. And so here you had basically an entire jurisprudence kind of a situation, kind of a whole, legal system basically at the wall, at the gate complex. So you could come and argue about things. At this point, you could also negotiate deals. You could do business and commerce here. There was evidence of monetary exchange in some of these. So you could actually do economics and commerce and investing and things like that in this little gate complex in one of these little offices. You could actually sell your goods. So you never actually had to come into the city at all to sell anything. You could just basically sell all your goods to a middleman here who would then take it in and sell it to market inside. So you would only have to ever interact at the gate. You would never actually have to come into the city of Sodom in this case. Right? So that's my example. Which was a fascinating thing, because what that basically meant was similar to our discoveries in the cell membrane, is not only was the membrane not just purely a defensive thing, but it was also a very highly functional thing. So now all of a sudden we saw all these activities. So instead of just going from a simple passive barrier, like we used to think the cell walls were, right now we're looking at a highly functional strategic area. So you can come to the gates of the city and you could get most of your business done with the city without ever having to enter the city, because most of the offices that you needed were there. And you never actually had to come into the city itself. And so that was like a watershed. There was like an incredible like revelation in archaeology, and it was a revelation in cell biology too, because now all of a sudden we realize that it's not just a passive situation. There is a bewildering amount of activity going on there. So a lot of things you don't ever have to bring into the cell, because you can do it right there at the cell membrane. So just to kind of circle back and complete the thought, what does the actual phrase mean then when it says something like Lot sat in the city gates of Sodom? He wasn't a greeter to Sodom. He was a judge. That's what it's saying. It was saying that Lot was a judge, which kind of puts a little bit of a different spin on the entire story, right? It's like he wasn't just some passive person in Sodom. He was probably a pretty well-respected member of the city. He was a judge at the gates, which means that the city entrusted him to basically adjudicate the laws of Sodom. So he was a civic leader in the city. He wasn't just some passive, nobody in Sodom. which kind of is an interesting twist on the tail, but that's something that we wouldn't have understood fully if we hadn't understood how these gate complexes work. And they work very similar to these membranes, because now you don't even have to come into the cell. You can do all your business right there at the cell membrane because there's just so much going on there. So that's basically a juiced up version of this slide. That you have a lot of stuff going on there, right? So you can think of peripheral proteins as being basically extra proteins that, even though themselves they are not embedded in the membrane, they're associated with the membrane, and they're usually working at the membrane itself. And so ultimately these peripheral proteins, they can attach to the membrane, and then they can also kind of help get things embedded in the membrane. So here's basically a protein that's kind of tethered to the membrane itself. So you can see how basically it's going to be attached to one of these phospholipids, and the rest of it is just kind of hanging out there. So this would be like an anchored protein. Anchored, but not embedded. So it's not an integral protein, right? It's not a transmembrane protein. It's an associated protein. So what do you need in order to integrate? What do you need in order to insert? Well, what you need is a transmembrane protein. So think about it for a second. You have your lipid bilayer. Now, there's a couple of things we know about the lipid bilayer, yes? We know that these heads here are polar. True? We know that this whole region right in here is nonpolar. And we know that this little head here is polar. So if you're going to be putting a protein in there, it has to have a striping pattern to it, right? So if I were to put a protein in here, the tips of this protein have to be surrounded with external amino acids that are polar. And the bottom tip also has to be polar, right? The middle has to be nonpolar to match its surroundings if it's going to slide in there. Well, the problem is, in order to get this alternating striping, you have to have a domain that does that for you. And that's what the transmembrane domain does. This basically has the polar, nonpolar, polar striping needed to insert. So when you take a look at this transmembrane domain, every single inserted or integrated protein has this. That's the reason why I call integral proteins transmembrane proteins, is because they all have this transmembrane domain to them. So here's what it looks like. So here you can see an alpha helix in this particular case. This region of the alpha helix is going to have polar, right? Because it has to match those polar heads. This region here has to be polar as well, right? And then the middle part of the helix has to be full of non-polars. That way you can get the striping effect. That's your transmembrane domain. If you do that, then what happens is when you kind of get that domain in next to the bilayer, it just, because of that organizational power of water, it spontaneously just locks in place and matches polar to polar and non-polar to non-polar. So you don't have to like cram it in there. It's all you have to do is get it close. And as soon as those polar tips start feeling those non-polar parts, it's automatically, it'll just snap into place. Okay, so it does that spontaneously. And so this is what's called a single pass, because it's got one transmembrane domain. And this other one is a bit more of a complicated one. So you can see you got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So this would be a 7 pass. Transmembrane domain. Because you got 7 domains. And you can see they all just basically insert in there. And then your protein will do whatever your protein is designed to do. Okay. So what this gives us the ability to do, though, is to make pores. We already saw pores, didn't we? Nuclear pores. So the question is, how do you make a nuclear pore? Well, it's easy, by inserting transmembrane domains into the envelope, right? So that's basically what you want to do. So in this particular case, what you want to do is you want to basically arrange these transmembrane domains into a circle. Generally speaking, you're creating a cylinder of beta sheets. So, right, that is your secondary structure that will create this. And when you create that cylinder of beta sheets, we oftentimes refer to it as a beta barrel because it kind of forms like a little round opening. And oftentimes the inner part is polar. What does this do? It allows passage of polar molecules. It's like a tunnel, right? This would be like a tunnel, like Eisenhower tunnel. Basically what's happening is you're creating this sort of beta sheet cylinder that has these sort of non-polar regions in it, in these transmembrane proteins, and you're creating a hole in a very inhospitable place, right? The non-polar area for water. Just like the mountain is a very inhospitable place for us. So what do? We basically create a hole in the mountain and we line that hole. If you've ever been at the Eisenhower tunnel, right? It's pretty nice in there, right? It's got lights in there. You got a little catwalk in case you get stuck, but it's all like tiled in. I mean, it's like really, it's a nice place in there, right? So it's an inviting environment for a driver. I mean, you don't want it to look like the inside of a mountain because that's going to creep people out. Right? They're going to feel like the mountain's about ready to cave in on them. Right? So it looks hospitable to a driver so that you can drive through it. And so that's basically what you've done. You've created this hole that's hospitable, in this case, to water to go through the actual membrane, which would otherwise not allow it to go through the membrane. And that's created ultimately by this beta barrel. So what I want to do is this is it right here. So you can see how you kind of weave these beta sheets in kind of like a woven basket, and you have polar inside that makes it hospitable for this molecule to go through it. Okay, so that's your beta barrel. So what we're going to do is we're going to start off with passive transport, the different types of transport. We'll start that off. No, in 2 weeks. Ooh, that sounds terrible, doesn't it? Don't unwind too much because we got a lot of semester left to go after we come back. Yes, I know, isn't it? Isn't that cruel?